So thank you very much for inviting me along. As you see here, my title is the Uses and Abuses of Patrick Pearse, because I'm going to be actually concentrating a lot on Pearse's, I suppose, his afterlife rather than his life. And as Mary said, I'm currently curator of the Pearse Museum out in Rathfarnham, which, if you haven't visited, please do. It's all very beautiful. It's Pearse's former home, but primarily it was where he ran his school, Scolena, between 1910 and 1916, and it was where he and his brother would have left to fight in the 1916 Rising. And as I said, working there, I am somewhat surrounded by Pearse. I was saying, when Mary mentioned 16 years, I was kind of going, that's probably the longest relationship I've had with anybody. But as I said, he's a quite fascinating character, so if you are going to be with one historical figure for such a long time, he's probably not the worst one to find yourself with. Lecture titles are interesting because unlike a book where you kind of write the book and then you come up with the title, with a lecture you come up with the title and then a year later you're kind of going, what was it I really wanted to say? And I was thinking about this whole idea of uses and abuses of Pearse about 2 weeks ago when I was on Pearse Street. This is if any of you are familiar with it, this is the Patrick Pearse pub. Pearse is a very unlikely person, I think, to name a pub after because of the many things that people say they would love to do with Pearse. Going for a pint with him is something that nobody ever suggested. And I was kind of wondering about I suppose, as curator of the Pearse Museum, what's my relationship with the Patrick Pearse pub? And I suppose my relationship is the same as anybody else's. One thing I've been very conscious of is not to set oneself up as the guardian of anybody's reputation. I suppose to a certain extent the dead look after themselves. So to a certain extent that whole idea of the uses and abuses of Pearse, I kind of balked a little bit about the idea of somehow sitting in judgment over how Pearse has been remembered. So with that caveat, I think we'll just maybe look a little bit, as I said, at how he's been remembered and how he kind of pops up and reappears in our life since his death following the 1916 Rising. I suppose the other thing about Pearse is visually one of the most identifiable figures in Irish history. When you see that profile, who we're talking about, and in many ways in terms of the 1916 Rising, he's become almost like part of the brand. So if you're flicking through the Irish Times and you see a picture of Pearse or the GPO in ruins, you know that they're talking about the 1916 Rising. And I think much more so than any of the other leaders, that face, that iconic face, has become, as I said, almost like the brand or the logo of the Rising. In order to understand about, I suppose, how we remember Pearse, I suppose it's maybe useful to look at why we remember Pearse or why he's significant. So he comes to public prominence through his involvement in the Gaelic League. He joins at a very young age. He's only a young man of 19, but very quickly finds himself on the Central Committee in 1903. He is editor of An Claidheamh Soilise, which is the newspaper, the organ of the Gaelic League. So he's, I suppose, at a very young age. He's born in 1879, so he's 24, and already he's in quite a prestigious position in Irish cultural life. And I suppose he uses his prominence to pursue his next great passion in 1908. As editor of An Claidheamh Soilise and as a member of the Gaelic League and the Irish Language Revival Movement, he begins to see that the key to the revival of the language is education. And he decides to set up this bilingual school that will teach through both English and Irish, and in addition be distinctly Irish in every aspect of its activity. So it's not just about the language, it's also about Irish identity. So he begins in 1908 in Collinswood House in Rathmines, probably closer to Ranelagh, to be honest. And then in 1910 he moves out to Rathfarnham to the house where, as I said, the Pearse Museum is located. But very quickly, I think he becomes very excited about the whole idea of education, the possibilities of education, and adopts quite a radical approach to education, which is very much about having a child-centred approach about nurturing the individual child's abilities and interests and inspiring the children under his care to become their best selves. So he famously told this story of an American man who came to him seeking advice because Pearse was a well-known educationalist about what he should do with his son who only wanted to play the tin whistle. And Pearse said, "I advise you to buy your son a tin whistle." And that, I suppose, in many ways kind of encapsulates a lot of his ideas about education. So there's a big emphasis as well in the school on the whole idea of the outdoors. That's probably the reason he moves to Rathfarnham, is to allow the boys to have, as he says himself, direct communication with the wild things. He has a little political dig. He says the only thing in Ireland that knows what freedom is. So these are some images of St. Enda's. This is a gardening class, a PE class, a sports. You can see the boys doing some kind of something in the river. I think with a vaguely nature focus. And he also, from the very beginning, sees the school as not just an end in itself, but something that is going to change Irish society. And he believes at this time that, I suppose, education is the key to the liberation of the country. And as a result, he, I think, uses St. Enda's almost as a showcase. And a big part of that, and a big way of them manifesting, I suppose, their Irish identity is through theatre. I suppose Pearse, like everybody else in Ireland at that time, seems to be writing a play, and it's kind of interesting that we're here surrounded by images of George Bernard Shaw. So these are images of some of the early plays. This is The Coming of Fionn. This is Eamon Bulfin, who's an Argentinian who raised the tricolour on the GPO in 1916. This is Dennis Gwynn, who was in the British Secret Service at the same time. And this is Frank Dowling, who played Cuchulainn, in many ways one of the great inspirations for the school. And as I said, these performances, this is actually Pearse's brother William. This is one of the last of the outdoor pageants. This was done in Rathfarnham. It was called Fionn, a Dramatic Spectacle, and it was done in 1914. But as I said, I've started to believe that these performances were not just for the people who came, but for Irish society as a whole. But I also feel that as, I suppose, Irish society becomes more radical, and as Pearse's, I suppose, on the practical side, as this educational project starts to run into serious problems around, principally around money, Pearse, I think, seeks some other great cause that can, I suppose, give meaning and focus to his life, and he becomes increasingly interested in politics. And one of the manifestations of this is in 1913, where he writes a series of articles called From a Hermitage. The Hermitage was the name of the house in Rathfarnham, for a political magazine called Irish Freedom. And he writes this series of articles which reflect all the big developments that are going on in Ireland at the time, whether it's a row in the Gaelic League, a controversy over a biography of George Moore's father, but also things like the 1913 lockout, the foundation of the Irish Volunteers. And what's interesting, I think, in terms of remembrance and symbols is Pearse is very taken with the importance of symbols. And one of the things he talks about is no one in Ireland either likes or dislikes George Wetton, by which he means George V. Yet every true man of Ireland hates or should hate to see his not very intellectual features on a coin or on a stamp, for they symbolise there the foreign tyranny that holds us. And I think in terms of the second part of my talk this evening, this is somewhat prescient, but it's interesting that Pearse sees the importance of these, what in some ways can seem just like, I suppose, empty symbols. Pearse sees these symbols as being very important in terms of Irish people's sense of themselves. And you see this kind of increasing move, I think, towards politics and out of the maybe cultural language movement throughout 1913. He's given the task of doing the oration at Wolfetone's graveside in Bodenstown in County Kildare. And interestingly, he talks about pledging himself and the crowd pledging themselves to fulfilling Tone's dream and Tone's ideal of breaking the connection with England. And he says we shouldn't pledge ourselves if we're not going to follow through on this. And again, this I think is quite significant, that Pearse, I think, is sensing that the time, whilst I suppose symbolic gestures are important and speeches are important, it's also a time to act. And then at the end of the year, then he becomes one of the founder members of the Irish Volunteer Force, which makes him a person of interest, not just to, I suppose, the British authorities in Ireland, but also to the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who are anxious to infiltrate the Irish volunteers and co-opt Pearse, I think, for their own ends. And they get their opportunity in 1914 when Pearse goes on a fundraising lecture tour of the United States. It would seem in the early 20th century, if any Irish enterprise ran out of money, they went to America to look for more. And while in America, Pearse comes to prominence as a speaker, but he also finds an audience who are very interested, not necessarily in Irish education, but in the developments around the Irish volunteers and what that might mean for the future of Ireland. And you can see this kind of increasing radicalism in his speeches. I also think he's a bit of a master of PR as well, because, as I said, I don't know how interested some of his audience were in the whole idea of bilingual Irish education. So this is his lecture title in Philadelphia, Irish Education and the New Volunteer Force. So he's I'll talk to you about the volunteers, but you have to hear about St. Enda's, and perhaps the hat will be going around. And when he returns with this reputation as a speaker, and it's for that reason that he is given the task of giving the oration at the graveside of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, the old Fenian who had been living in exile in the United States and whose body is returned to Ireland to be buried, and is used by the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Tom Clark in particular as a way, I think, of not only inspiring interest and recruiting people for their more radical agenda of a revolutionary overthrow of British rule in Ireland, but also, I think, a way of maybe kind of testing the waters to see how much support there is for that separatist tradition. And Pearse is given this role of giving this speech, and I think when he does this, I suppose, for one thing, it seals his position within Irish history, that this speech becomes one of the key moments in 20th century Irish history. But it also makes him the face of what is a secret revolutionary plan to overthrow British rule. So it's very interesting that this clandestine movement suddenly has a public face, and that public face is Patrick Pearse. And you can see this in the weeks and months leading up to the 1916 Rising. This is Pearse and Dolphin's Barn down the road from where I live. I'm giving a speech. But what's really interesting as well is he also uses this time to write a series of political pamphlets. And these are written pretty much from December to December 1915 through to April 1916. And in these pamphlets, I think what Pearse is doing is he's flagging the coming revolution. He knows that they won't be around maybe to explain what the revolution is going to be about. So he contextualizes the revolution within the Irish Republican revolutionary tradition. And Pearse very much kind of has steeped himself in that tradition. And I think he understands it more than anybody else involved in that movement. And what he achieves, I think, through these pamphlets is he shows the Rising not as a break, as a revolution is usually viewed, but actually what he suggests is that revolution is continuity. Revolution is the Irish tradition. And actually the status quo is actually the break with the past. The status quo is in fact, I suppose, the radical break in what Irishness is all about. So they're kind of fascinating pieces of writing, but also I think key in terms of why Pearse becomes, I suppose, the voice of the Rising after he dies, because with the exception of Connolly, he's the only one that leaves any explanation as to what it is. He also writes in this, I suppose, quasi-religious tones. So I said, this is just a quote from one of these pamphlets. And he talks about this idea that the nation's freedom is not to be found in the statute books of the nation's enemy, it is to be found in the books of the nation's fathers. So again, he's emphasizing this sense of tradition. And he anoints 4 evangelists of Irish separatism. So you have James Fintan Lawler, John Mitchell, Thomas Davis, and Wolfe Tone. And of course, what he is also, to a certain extent, anointing himself as the 5th evangelist. And he writes in this very religious language, and it's very much a feature of Pearse's writing. But also, I think he realizes that this kind of symbolism and this kind of language is something that is going to be very understandable to his audience. He knows he's writing for a deeply, I suppose many say, a very deeply religious, quite a conservative Irish audience. And using the symbolism and the language of religion is something that will appeal to them and will be something that they will be able to engage with. The other thing he does is he does what I call a poetic dress rehearsal for the 1916 Rising when he writes a play, The Singer. And again, this is his his romantic envisioning of what the Rising might be. His Rising doesn't take place in Dublin, of course. It takes place in the west of Ireland in an Irish-speaking community. And in the end, the revolution is led by the hero, Macdara, who goes, as he says, naked, with no weapons in front of his people, and I suppose is to a certain extent is very explicitly comparing what he's doing with the sacrifice of Christ. And I think what all this means is that when the 1916 Rising comes along, and if we look at the Rising maybe as a rising which is a revolution that's going to success by the way it inspires those who come afterwards, rather than one that is going to be successful militarily, and I think at a certain point it's clear that that's not going to happen. It means that because Pearse understands the revolutionary tradition and he understands how these kind of symbols work, he understands the 1916 Rising in a way that maybe none of his the other leaders really ever did. And what he contributes actually are these kind of almost theatrical set pieces. So this is a wonderful 1960s rendition of Pearse outside the GPO, pasting up the proclamation, which of course he's written. So again, he's writing the Rising once again. The other thing he does as well is when all hope is lost and the surrender comes, Pearse comes in full uniform with his sword to surrender. And sometimes Pearse has kind of mocked this idea of him cycling in from Rathfarnham trying to balance a sword on his bike. But actually, this sword becomes really important, I think, because Pearse is able to give this surrender a dignity that will be crucial in terms of the 1916 Rising inspiring those who come afterwards. So it's not a humiliation. And he's able to meet the pomp and circumstance of the British Army. You can do pomp and circumstance like nobody else. He can meet it almost in kind, and I think that's really key. And very quickly, this kind of quasi-religious aspect to Pearse becomes embedded in the public psyche. Particularly, I think, because of the poetry that he writes. He writes his poem to his mother, a poem that nearly every Irish person is familiar with, and again something that appeals both to the veneration of the Virgin Mary, which is so big in Ireland at that time, but also, of course, the veneration of the mother within Irish culture. As I said, this is a cartoon which is done very, very quickly. This is almost contemporary with the 1916 Rising. And what's interesting is this group event, this event that is planned by Thomas Clarke, which wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Clarke and McDermott and the IRB, very quickly becomes associated with just one person, becomes associated with Pearse. And what's interesting as well is you see almost a visual creation of Pearse as icon. This is one of many, many images of Pearse. It was taken by Lafayette Photographic Studios. And very quickly, it's the one that's used again and again. This is a drawing of Pearse, which was done in 1916. So even though there are other images of Pearse, it is that one that really takes hold. I suppose the other thing is because of Pearse's favouring of the profile image, again, he assumes this kind of iconic role. He literally becomes an icon. Interestingly, this side profile stems from Pearse's self-consciousness about he had a turn in one of his eyes, You can see here, these are two photographs taken at the same time. He's with his family. In the first one, he's somewhat unself-conscious, and you can see both of his eyes. In the next one, he's realised, and you can see the self-consciousness. He's turned to the side, and you can see what I think is really interesting is just how awkward his presence make what should be, I suppose, an informal family shot. At the time, of course, you can very much, when Pearse is growing up, you can very much control how you're photographed because photography is largely a formal event. But even though he kind of lives into the cusp of the informal snap, and when he becomes a public figure, of course, he is often photographed by photojournalists. You keep seeing these side profiles, and then when you read people's descriptions of meeting him, they say that he didn't meet people, he didn't make eye contact directly with people, he would hold his head slightly to the side. So this, I suppose, this manifestation of insecurity ultimately becomes, ironically, a sign of, or is used to create this kind of, I suppose, the Pearse myth and this iconic image. The other thing that really starts to, I suppose, influence how people view Pearse is his mother. A lot of it, I think, stems from the idea that she's the mother of two executed sons. Both Patrick and William Pearse are both executed. The poetry, of course, and this, as I said, that symbolism of the mother of the crucified son is something that's very likely to appeal to Irish society. This is her in 1924. She's in San Francisco on a fundraising tour again for the school, but also I think she's been sent there by De Valera to, I suppose, bolster support for the anti-treaty side. This is a picture done in the 1960s from our collection. She ends up being a TD for a while, and she becomes one of the voices in the anti-treaty debates. And her contribution becomes quite iconic. She said, "It has been said on several occasions that Patrick Pearse would have accepted this treaty. I deny it. As his mother, I deny it, and on his account, I will not accept it. Always we had to be on the alert, but even the black and tans alone would not frighten me as much as if I accepted this treaty, because I feel in my heart, and I would not say it, only I feel it, that the ghosts of my sons would haunt me." And I said that so much of people's perception of Pearse then becomes, it's kind of filtered through that relationship with his mother. Interestingly, again in 1926, she becomes a key part of the protest against the plough and the stars. There's a big part of the protest is the presence of Rosie Redmond, a prostitute, in the play, and also Nora Clitheroe's attempts to prevent her husband going to fight in the 1916 Rising. And Hannah Shee Skeffington organises a protest of the women of 1916 who turn up in the opening week of the play. And she Skeffington says, "The women of Easter week as we know them are typified rather in the mother of Patrick Pearse, that valiant woman who gave both her sons for Irish freedom." And it's kind of interesting as well that to a certain extent she is, of all the women of 1916, she's kind of placed there at the very top. Interestingly, I think it's the mother rather than the wife, this kind of this pure relationship which is untainted by sexual desire. So it's interesting that it's not Kathleen Clarke, it's not Grace Plunkett, despite the romance of that story. It's the mother once again. So in 1932, she is given the honour by Eamon de Valera of being the person who starts the presses on the Irish press. She's given the first copy of the newspaper, which we still have in our collection. And she's a founder member of Fianna Fáil, herself and her daughter. And this is very key for de Valera's attempts to, I suppose, claim the mantle of the 1916 Rising. Also in that year, you see the publication of one of the first biographies of Pearse, the first full-length by a Breton writer, Louis Leroux. And interesting, Leroux quotes A. de Balcom in the biography, saying it would be astonishing if Pearse was. It would not be astonishing if Pearse was canonized one day. So I suppose it gives you kind of a sense of the kind of biography that was happening for Pearse in those areas, and how he's been created and how he's been positioned. Though interestingly, in the early years of the state, and probably because of Mrs. Pearse's anti-treaty stance, it makes it a little bit difficult for the Free State government to commemorate him. One of the few things that they do is they change the name of the street on which he was born. So this is number 27 Great Brunswick Street, where his father had a stone carving business. You can see it here. This is Pearse & Sons, 27 Great Brunswick Street. Pearse avoids how to translate Great Brunswick Street by just not including it all in the Irish. And it's then renamed in 1926 as Pearse Street. But there's very little actually in the early years of the state. But I think particularly once De Valera gets in, then you start to see some heavy duty commemoration. Oliver Shepherd, a former teacher of William Pearse, and I suppose a friend of Patrick, he is personally asked by Eamon De Valera to create this bust of Pearse for Leinster House. So it's created in 1936, installed in Dáil Éireann actually in 1937. While John Turpin, who's written the biography of Shepherd, says that it further emphasised the origins of the Dáil in the revolution which Pearse had commenced, I also think that this Pearse is also being used here to add kind of dignity and a sense of heritage and stability to the new state. So these are our founding fathers, and we have dressed them in the cloths of the neoclassical. This is another image of Pearse. This is both of these are now in the Pearse Museum. This is a marble bas-relief carved by the Cork sculptor Seamus Murphy, and interestingly, it featured in the Irish Pavilion in the World's Fair in New York in 1939. This pavilion created by the architect Michael Scott, which was designed to be both modern yet distinctly Irish, and it's interesting that Pearse is part of that. And after Mrs. Pearse passes away in 1932, her daughter, Margaret, Patrick's sister, in many ways assumes the mantle and becomes again a key person for Eamon De Valera. She serves a term as well as a TD, and then becomes a senator pretty much for the rest of her life until she dies in 1968. You can see her here in Arbour Hill at a commemoration. And then in 1965, Pearse has his apotheosis in Galway Cathedral, where in the mortuary chapel they created a mosaic, and on one side you have Patrick Pearse, on the other side you have John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Interesting bedfellows, I think. But what's interesting with all this commemoration that's happening, what is maybe interesting is Pearse's relationship with the Irish education system in the new state. So new teachers who go for teacher training are required to read his three lectures on Gaelic topics, which he wrote at 17, which is kind of interesting. I think even Pearse would have been surprised at that. He becomes required reading for student teachers. He becomes part of his short stories are part of the Irish curriculum. Children are asked, why would you like to visit Scoilena? Principally, I imagine, children in the 1950s and 60s because they didn't have corporal punishment. But one of the things that typifies, the disconnect between Pearse's ideas of education and this new state in terms of objects. This is Pearse's Isagan agus Céalta Eile, which he wrote in 1906 for students of the Irish language, and he put a big emphasis on creating a beautiful book with beautiful illustrations which should help students to understand what they're reading and also, I suppose, kind of engage them. So these are these beautiful illustrations done by Beatrice Elvery, later Lady Glenavy. She was one of the sports shop Elverys. This is what's produced by the Gaelic League after Pearse's death. This is their version of Isagan agus Céalta Eile. I'd show you the illustrations, but there are none. And I think this contrast is quite interesting. What's also interesting is, of course, Pearse, one of his final pamphlets on a non-political subject is The Murder Machine, in which he rails against the what he sees as the industrialised education system that Britain is imposing on Ireland, where children are taught by rote, where they're forced to read and take in the opinions of their teachers in their school books and simply regurgitate that back for exams. And he's particularly incensed by this emphasis on exams, and this is, as I said, why he describes it as a murder machine. And he talks about the idea of developing children's individual talents and cherishing their individuality and their ability. So it's, I think, somewhat kind of galling then that a nation state that claims its origins from Pearse presides over something called an industrial school. And I suppose to add insult to injury, this is a letter frac located in Connemara, I suppose, where the area of Ireland where Pearse, I suppose, saw as Ireland's kind of soul, or Ireland's spiritual home. And there is something kind of shocking about the conservatism of Irish education, given its origins with a radical educationalist. And it seems to me the more that Pearse had his image hung up in Irish classrooms, the easier it was to maybe forget the greater challenge that he laid out in pamphlets like The Murder Machine. By the time 1966 comes along, one of Pearse's biographers from that year wrote that for the man in the street since the 20s, Patrick Pearse and his name alone has come to mean the 1916 Rising. And Pearse very much, I think, again dominates the 1966 celebrations. And you can see Pearse got his head on the 10-shilling piece. It was designed by T.H. Paget. And Kathleen Clark was very angry about the emphasis on Pearse in the 1966 commemorations. She wrote to a friend, Eamon Martin, "I think it is a dreadful thing for people to be trying to rob Tom Clark of the one honour conferred on him by his own comrades, and if Pearse signed himself president without authority, as it seems he did, I feel he is beneath contempt. Surely Pearse could have been satisfied with the honour of Commander-in-Chief when he knew as much about commanding as my dog." What I think is interesting is even in 1966, I think maybe Kathleen Clark is probably not understanding maybe why the 1916 Rising happened, but it was, I said, I'm sure very galling for her, particularly given the fact that if it wasn't for her husband, there certainly would have been no 1916 Rising, whereas if there had been no Pearse, it would have been a different event, but you would still have had a Rising. And you see this kind of rash of things being named after Pearse throughout this period. So this is Pearse train station, which is actually named after both Pearse brothers. It's Stáisiún Nabírsa, so it's the Pearse's train station. This is Pearse Stadium in Galway, which was named after him in 1957. There is no end to Na Pearsaigh GAA teams. This is Limerick, named after Pearse in 1968. Na Pearsaigh in Cork from 1943. That was supposed to be Pearse College in Crumlin, which is 1979. This is Coláiste Cuimhneacháin on Pearsaigh in Rossmuck, named after him in 1933. This is Coláiste on Pearsaigh, which is in Rathfarnham in the old Loreto Convent, which opened in 2014. But interestingly, despite all this official commemoration, Pearse also has his radical edge. This is a truck owned by Joe McHenry, a veteran of the War of Independence and Civil War, and you can see here Ireland's still not free. So Pearse is still present among the more radical Republicans who haven't followed De Valera into, I suppose, an acceptance of the new state. And when the Troubles break out then in 1972, Pearse again becomes very important to more radical elements in that Republican tradition. So this is a hanky from our collection, which was painted or drawn with the image of Pearse by a guy called Mickey McAteer in 1972. You also see in this period a greater questioning of Pearse. One of the key books, I suppose, is in many ways, the first proper biography of Pearse, Patrick Pearse and the Triumph of Failure by Ruth Dudley Edwards. And in many ways, this book is a lecture in itself, but what's interesting is there's kind of a furore around her questioning that Pearse may have had latent homosexual tendencies. And I think probably what was equally as shocking is the idea that her perhaps less iconic portrayal of Pearse, and the portrayal of Pearse maybe as a maybe somewhat more human figure. It's not nearly as unkind to Pearse as people sometimes imagine. Pearse, once again, comes to prominence in 1979, the centenary of his birth. That's the year that the Pearse Museum opens. And interestingly, again, of course, this is the period of the Troubles, and there's a big emphasis in terms of his commemoration to emphasise his role as a cultural figure and as an educationalist, and I suppose in some ways to play down the radical aspect of his life. That said, there are those who are anxious to use this day, this year, as a way of kind of reviving and supporting the Troubles in Northern Ireland, including a young red-headed member of the State Assembly of New York from the Bronx, who wrote his master's thesis on Patrick Pearse, and who gave a talk in 1979 which linked Pearse, the provost, and 1776. His answer to those who denounce violence in pursuit of justice is to ask, where would you be in 1776? There was a commemorative stamp as well by Robert Balla, which again proved controversial. Part of the controversy was it was based on Delacroix's Liberty at the Barricades, and the presence of the naked woman was very controversial for some. A woman who wrote the Irish Independent objected to this outrageous insult to Pearse, who had died so that Ireland might be free, Irish and Christian. In the year that also marked the centenary of the Knock operation, she castigated those responsible for looking to a foreign country and choosing the most pagan of symbols. My favourite, there was a letter into the Irish Times, which I think was very clever. It said it should just be referred to as Erin Nobra. Interestingly, there was also, and this pops up, throughout the second half of the 20th century, a proposal to replace where Nelson Spiller had been with a statue of Pearse, which ran into trouble. I can't work out if it's trouble because of the inclusion of Pearse, or there seems to have been kind of rival projects trying to vie for the attention of the corporation. I'm sure Mary can tell us all about those situations. Pearse also kind of turns up in odd places as well. This is a bust of Pearse from 1982, which you can find in the Plaza Irlanda in Buenos Aires. There's a big Irish community Irish and Argentinian community. So this is a translation of Pearse's poetry, which appeared in 1979. But one area where Pearse turns up is actually in the power struggle in 1979 between Charles Haughey and Jack Lynch. Jack Lynch is very anxious, as I said, to contain the potential of the commemoration to destabilise the situation in Northern Ireland. Charlie Haughey, would seem, is anxious to use Pearse as a way of showing his Republican credentials. And he gives a speech on the 12th in November of 1979, around the time of the Pearse's birthday, saying, like any other statesman, Pearse considered the will of the country taken as a whole was what mattered. Pearse believed that Ireland's history made her spiritually, intellectually and politically one insoluble nation. And you can imagine for Jack Lynch, who had earlier said that the paradox of Pearse's message today is that we must work and live for Ireland, not die and certainly not kill for it. You can see there's a big disconnect there. And I think Haughey is very much using this. John Kelly, the great parliamentarian, castigated Charlie Haughey from the opposition benches, and he spoke of Haughey's low profile during the Cork by-election, but following their loss, how Haughey chooses the moment of personal humiliation for Mr. Lynch to emerge distributing free toothbrushes and burning sentiments about Pearse. And interesting, the following year, Garrett Fitzgerald, in his famous flawed pedigree speech, mentioned Haughey's protestations of republicanism, which suddenly blossomed for the Patrick Pearse centenary. However, what you find happening the next year is the coming of the hunger strikes, and Pearse becomes a central part of the hunger strikes ideology. You start to see quotes from the O'Donovan Rossa speech at protests supporting Bobby Sands, and you start to see Pearse is literally appearing on the walls in Belfast. This is a mural from West Belfast, as you can see, from 1982. And as Roisin Higgins wrote in 2009, Pearse used to stabilise and destabilise Irish politics. His myth, suddenly promoted, could not be controlled easily. And I feel around this period, Pearse becomes, if anything, somewhat toxic as a brand. And you don't get to hear Pearse being mentioned that often. He is invoked in the, I suppose, the culture wars. Laura Samoroku uses the occasion of the presentation of the Pearse Scholarship to criticise RT for giving a platform to pro-choice supporters. Obviously, this is the period of the debate around the Eighth Amendment. So it's interesting to see how we're still there. Sister Mary Dolores of Nina wrote to the Irish Times in 1986 saying, "I used to teach my history class that Patrick Pearse died to save the soul of Ireland. Is it being lost from home as well as foreign influences?" And I said, throughout the 90s, Pearse becomes the battleground where debate about the legitimacy of the 1916 Rising rages. But with the Good Friday Agreement, you start to see Pearse, I think, kind of emerging out of that mire a little bit. And you find him emerging, of all places, in the Taoiseach's office in Marion, on Marion Street. And it's very interesting, I think, how Bertie Ahern, I suppose, uses Pearse. In his biography, he says, "Over my own head, I put a picture of Patrick Pearse, whose image had always been near my desk, even as I did my homework in Church Avenue." So he relates Pearse to his childhood in a working class area of Dublin among ordinary working people. And I think what's interesting is at this time of the Celtic Tiger, of this rapid change culturally, socially, economically, and I suppose in this rapid, I don't know, it almost seems like a fever dream at this stage to us, which we're happily, it seems, heading right back into, but that's again, another lecture. Pearse is used, I think, by Bertie Ahern to suggest a sense of continuity with those older traditions, that in some ways that we haven't lost our soul in this kind of orgy of money and excess. But what's interesting is, after it all comes tumbling down, with the collapse of the Celtic Tiger, I suppose a lot of us remember a lot of those think pieces where people return to the idea of the Irish Republic and, how had we lost our way from the ideals of the early years of that revolutionary movement, and that idea of, I suppose, of cherishing the children of the nation equally, and how had we lost our way in our orgy of SUVs and holiday homes on the Bulgarian coast. And I suppose what's been very interesting for me last year was to see where Pearse would find himself again. So this is President Higgins. We had a state event centred around the Irish language on the 7th of July last year out in the Pearse Museum. And it was, again, an interesting kind of very much emphasis on Pearse's influence culturally and educationally in that event. And I thought what was interesting for us was to see the engagement, particularly among young people, with what Pearse was about in terms of culture and education, and I suppose in terms of the idea of encouraging the development of young people's creativity. So these are members of Tallaght Community Arts who performed for the president, but they also did a pageant over a period of a week, inspired by that pageant, The Coming of Fionn, that I showed you earlier, This is their recreation of the not just the school games, but also the myth of Cuchulainn. What's very interesting is our Cuchulainn in 2016 is originally from Ghana. But again, what I thought for us, what I suppose was somewhat gratifying was that they were able to find within Pearse something that inspired them and excited them and interested them. This is Pearse again appearing on his cottage in Rossmuck in Connemara, which again is looked after by the Office of Public Works, who employ me and look after the Pearse Museum. And again, just interesting to see Pearse emerging and the Pearse family emerging on the streets. So this is Mrs. Pearse here. This is Pearse on Liffey Street. just there. He's suffering from the weather. Pearse and Brown Thomases. Pearse in the back of the bus, trying to get people to get the 16 to Rathfarnham. I know I took that because that's my route into work. And then kind of rather surprisingly, and I wasn't quite expecting it, Pearse at Dublin Pride in 2016, suggesting that there's a kind of Pearse who in many ways kind of throughout his life reinvented himself and has been frequently reinvented since his death, shows no intention of stopping that tradition. So that's it from me. So thank you very much.